All right, you're all set.
Alrighty. Christian influence on U.S. laws and culture throughout history. Novitiate takeover. So first we'll have U.S. Christianity's early influence on U.S. laws and culture, 1600s to the late 1800s, presented by Major Murdoch. Next will be Phyllis Schlafly and Morality Politics, 1950 to the 1970s by Oni, and then how these influences have affected today's legal, political, and cultural climate, presented by Kaylee. Q&A and general discussion to follow. All right, U.S. Christianity's early influence on U.S. laws and culture, 1600s to 1800s. In the 1620s, Pilgrims land in Plymouth, and I like to theme this whole time as God gave us land. The Pilgrims arrive and settle in italics, Plymouth colony. The Pilgrims were considered religious extremists in their days, mainly the Puritans. They were not wanted in England. Many of them immigrated to the Netherlands initially, and then when they found out about the people traveling west to the New World, they all decided they would hop on and come out this way. They landed in what is known as Massachusetts, where a plague had wiped out a portion of the Wampanoag Nation a few years prior. The Pilgrims saw this as a sign from God that he had given them this land, and they were now the rightful owners. Of course, this led to the Pilgrims using this concept that God had given them the land as justification for enslavement and to hunt the native peoples and other nearby native nations, which we all know throughout U.S. history how the rest of that turned out. In the 1800s, this is where things get particularly potent. God gives us power over others. Of course, we have the Civil War, where the main issue is slavery. The cartoon here is something that I found depicting Southern clergymen who were coming up with reasons to justify slave ownership. So yeah, it says, during an eloquent discussion, an eminent Southern clergyman is wonderfully assisted in finding scriptural authority for succession and treason and the divine ordination of slavery. I also thought it was interesting that they were using the depiction of Satan at that time to demonize others, even though they are demonizing some rather horrible people. This guy is a true asshole to no end, Pastor James Henley Thornwell. He was the senior pastor of First Presbyterian Church in Columbia, South Carolina, from 1850 to 1862, where he died. He was a slave owner, so he had personal and financial incentive to preach the way he did and encourage his followers to feel the way they did and do what they did. After the Confederacy was declared, he helped start the Confederate Presbyterian Church, and he used to travel the Southwest U.S. preaching pro-slavery and pro-white doctrine. Some notable quotes. The relation of master and slave stands on the same foot with other relations of life. In itself, it is not inconsistent with the will of God. It is not sinful. He presented this in 1851 in an address to the Synod of South Carolina. So even right here, we can see that they're using the will of God to free themselves of any guilty burden by saying slave ownership is not sinful. This particular next quote really boils my blood. As long as that African race and its comparative degradation coexist side by side with the white, bondage is its normal condition. The scriptures not only fail to condemn, they as distinctly sanction slavery as any other social condition of man. 1861, inaugural address to the Confederate Presbyterian Church, First Pres of Augusta, Georgia. Fun fact is I used to go to that church, and in fact, it was the last church I attended before moving out here to Colorado. So that feels great to know now. Thomas Auld, Frederick Douglass's former master. I found this while looking around, thought it was a cool effect, not necessarily one individual person being influential, but more so a sign of that influence on others. Frederick Douglass mentions in his memoirs, Narrative and Life of Frederick Douglass, that he recalls Thomas Auld, his former master's conversion to Christianity after attending a Methodist camp meeting. Douglass hoped this would bring a kinder man out of his master who would free his slaves, but instead this radicalized Auld. Douglass recalls Auld praying at all times of the day and inflicting more pain and suffering on his slaves to the point of beating a lame woman, all, all regularly used the Old Testament to justify his cruel actions on his slaves. And that's what we've got so far. Just some cool fun facts with James Thornwell. The First Presbyterian Church of Columbia, South Carolina, still has a hall named after him, along with several paintings and recognitions on church grounds towards him. The church has refused to change anything, not seeing how that would affect the culture even today, regardless what he said in the past. So that the feeling in that area is still rather the same as it was back then. I did look into the church's demographics, and it's mostly white, and they haven't really ever considered minorities as part of their congregation. Here's also a picture of the church in Columbia. But yeah, that's my part of it. And next we'll have Oni presenting the 1950s to the 70s.
All right, thank you, Judas. Let's see. Where go? Okay, so I guess I was curious largely about how did all this religious hatred get involved in politics, and how did the religious right become a thing? So today I want to talk about someone named Phyllis Schlafly. Now, for people who do not know who Phyllis Schlafly is, she was a right-wing activist focused on quote-unquote morality politics. She's probably best known for killing the Equal Rights Amendment. She never held office, and she doesn't have the same name recognition as someone like, say, Jerry Falwell, but she is arguably the single most important person in creating the religious right and wrapping up religious intolerance into right-wing politics. So a bit of background, some of her earlier political work involved working for extremist anti-communist groups. This included the Cardinal Mincensi Foundation, which she actually founded along with her husband and her sister-in-law. That was a Catholic anti-communist organization that was meant to educate other Catholics about the dangers of domestic and foreign communism. She was also a member and worked with the John Birch Society, which she denied her entire life. Recently, a journalist using the Freedom of Information Act uncovered documents that conclusively show that Phyllis Schlafly was in fact a member of the John Birch Society. So she is straight up deranged in terms of her anti-communism. For one thing, she believes essentially an early form of QAnon type beliefs. She thinks that communists have infiltrated the government at the highest levels, including the mainstream wing of the Republican Party. She believes Truman is a secret communist, etc. And during this period working with these groups, Schlafly does a lot of propaganda writing, and that's a skill she would use for the rest of her life. So fast forward to 1960, Nixon, despite being a terrible racist person, he sees the writing on the wall. He understands that Americans no longer support segregation, and so he decides that at least they should add a plank to the RNC platform that's an anti-segregation and anti-discrimination plank. Schlafly hates this idea, and she leads a revolt of quote-unquote moral conservatives against adding the plank. Now, it's worth noting that this seems to be the first use of moral conservative or any related terms. Moral majority did not exist yet at this time. So in 64, Schlafly meets an Arizona senator named Barry Goldwater, and she decides he's the extremist candidate she's been looking for. Goldwater is considered by many to be kind of like a proto Trump. He's this dark horse candidate that is considered extremist and hated by the party mainstream, but he has this wide ranging populist appeal. Um, he is running in 64 in a primary against Nelson Rockefeller, who's loved by the party elite but hated by many common Republicans. So Schlafly, he or Goldwater's constituency, there at this point there's different sides to the Republican Party. There used to be a more liberal wing of the Conservative Party, and that's where Rockefeller was from, and that was the East Coast, was the more liberal part, and the South and Western Republicans were the more conservative side. So Goldwater appeals to the South and Western Republicans, and his constituency is largely consists of white men in revolt against integration, which Schlafly likes just fine because she is also anti-integration. Of course, they will claim things like, well, I'm not anti-integration, I'm just anti-government enforcement of integration. And of course, they never provide a alternative way for integration to actually happen if the government doesn't enforce it. But anyway, Schlafly writes her first book called A Choice, Not an Echo, and it's meant to be propaganda for Goldwater's campaign. And in this book, she talks about secret Republican kingmakers among the party, East Coast section of the party, and basically says they're stealing the nomination from the South and Western conservative wing of the party. The book sells 3 million copies, and it's often credited with getting Goldwater the nomination. So there's a whole lot more to talk about Goldwater and racism wise. In the interest of saving time, here's some Klan members holding Goldwater signs. Hope that says enough for now. So after Goldwater wins the nomination, he runs against Johnson and loses bad. It is the record, the worst loss in a presidential race in history. And so a lot of people see this as proof that the extremist right politics are over and done with. They got defeated, they're dead. And because of this, people kind of stopped paying attention to Schlafly for a while. Um, it's not until 1972 that Schlafly finally comes up with her next campaign that'll put her back into public attention. Stop ERA. STOP is an acronym standing for Stop Taking Our Privileges, and ERA refers to the Equal Rights Amendment. Equal Rights Amendment simply states the equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. So Schlafly begins to assemble this coalition of white Christian conservative housewives by convincing them the ERA is an attack on them and would take away their right to be housewives. She once said, I think the main goal of the feminist movement was the status degradation of the full-time homemaker, if that gives you an idea of her sort of rhetoric. Another thing she used to convince these women to join her were family values arguments. Things like the terrors of unisex bathrooms and the importance of maintaining traditional gender roles. So she described her recruits in an interview with The Atlantic at one point as housewives that, quote, didn't even know where their state capital was. And Schlafly takes these women and teaches them the art of political action. And this includes things like teaching them how to dress, how to speak, how to smile for the camera, etc. And her campaign is a massive success. Before her campaign started, polls showed that 3 out of 4 Americans supported the ERA. By the time she's done, she kills the ERA. It does not make it into the Constitution. So during this campaign, she also starts to turn homophobia into a political tool. Uh, it becomes a major focus of her Stop ERA campaign. She talks about things like how the ERA will enable gay marriage and gay adoptions and how scary that is. Um, in her Eagle Forum newsletter, she publishes bigoted and homophobic and transphobic cartoons on a regular basis. And adding the homophobic rhetoric to the Stop ERA campaign helped her unite different religious groups such as evangelicals, Catholics, and Orthodox Jews. And these groups normally would not have worked together with each other. They don't have that much in common, but they can unite under the banner of being dicks to gay and trans people. So I want to end with a few quotes about Schlafly's lasting influence. To start with, this is from Tanya Mellick, who was a Republican activist and contemporary of Schlafly's, who left the party finally in '98 due to women's issues. So this is from her book, The Republican War Against Women, an Insider's Report from Behind the Lines. Quote, "It was Schlafly, with her authoritarian leadership and expert grassroots organizing, who made the religious right a political player. It was Schlafly, first of the Goldwater and then the New Right team, who unearthed the political gold of misogyny." This next quote is from a book from Ellie Langford and Elise Ho called The Lie That Binds. It's about how abortion became a major political issue. Quote, "Falwell's crusade against school integration was losing favor with the general public around the same time it was activating their base. Wayridge was already casting around for new ideas. Never short on ambition, he wrote about plans to build a, quote, new political philosophy that would be, quote, defined by us conservatives in moral terms, packaged in non-religious language, and propagated throughout the country by our new coalition." Wayridge and Falwell took note of Schlafly's political prowess and her ability to organize new voices in the conservative coalition. They didn't dwell on the differences between her public-facing messages about gender equality and their own, still centered on religious freedom and school segregation. They saw the harmony in their ideology and their narratives. Both factions, after all, were warning their audience that the new buzzwords of equality, whether they were applied to Black people, gay people, or women, were tantamount to attacking your family, your way of life, and your privileged status. So to me, this quote kind of represents why I think Phyllis Schlafly is the most important person in the creation of the religious right. In terms of direct action, I think Jerry Falwell and Wayridge and the moral majority probably did more to create it than Schlafly did. But Schlafly gives them the blueprint to take hate and wrap it up in a way that makes it palatable to the American population. Without Wayridge, Falwell, and the moral majority, we probably would not have the religious right. But without Schlafly, we probably would not have had Wayridge, Falwell, and the moral majority, among others. So I wanted to end with this. It's a quote from a podcast, Behind the Bastards, which this was a big inspiration for me doing this topic. So Robert Evans, the host, is talking about Schlafly and her creation of all these culture wars. Quote, "And that's her goal, to make as many of those issues as possible, because they create a durable coalition. People will not leave your coalition if you convince them that the only thing on the other side is the devil." And thank you, everybody. I have some sources here. If anybody wants them, let me know. I'm happy to share out the presentation. That's all I got. So on to Kaylee. Thank.
Okay. All right, so I'll be going over some of the effects of Christianity in today's cultural, legal, and political climate in the United States. So one thing that immediately came to my mind was Donald Trump's actions at St. John's Church. Basically, he wanted this picture in front of the church so badly that he forcefully dispersed protesters. Bishop Buddy denounced the way that President Trump held up a Bible during his visit, a move which she interpreted as a political prop. She said he did not pray, he did not mention George Floyd, he did not mention the agony of the people who have been subjected to this kind of horrific expression of racism and white supremacy for hundreds of years. So I think that she really said it best, and this got me thinking that I wanted to look further into the relationship between religion and some of these recent topics. All right, so I'm going to be showing some graphs that are from the Public Religion Research Institute, which is an American nonprofit, nonpartisan research and education organization that conducts public opinion polls on a variety of different topics, specializing in the quantitative and qualitative study of political issues as they relate to religious values. Please keep in mind that many factors could play a role in survey results, and correlation doesn't necessarily indicate causation. Their methodology is on their website, so I can link that at the end if anyone wants to check it out. Okay, so this graph, it's the percent of people who say that recent police killings of Black men are isolated incidents by white subgroups. The blue bar, June 2020, is most recent. So we can see it's broken down into political party, education, and religion. So this bottom section where the religion is shown, we can see that white evangelical Protestants, 72% agreed with that statement that recent police killings of Black men are isolated incidents. 53% of white mainline Protestants agreed. 56% of white Catholics agreed, and 30% of white unaffiliated people agreed. This next one is the percent of people who agree with the statement. Discrimination against whites has become just as big of a problem as discrimination against Black Americans or other minorities. So the same thing, the blue bar is the most recent, June 2020. So again, we see political party, education, and religion. And we can see white evangelical Protestants, 56% agreed. White mainline Protestant, 43%. White Catholic, 51%. And white unaffiliated, 30%. Okay, this one is perceptions of discrimination against different groups in the United States today by religious affiliation. So we're seeing the percent who think there is a lot of discrimination against each of these groups listed on the left. The gray dot is all Americans. The blue dot is white evangelical Protestant. The green dot is white mainline Protestant. The yellow dot is Protestant of color. The orange dot is white Catholic. The purple dot is religiously unaffiliated. So down the list here, we see the white evangelical Protestants thought there was a lot less discrimination than the rest of the groups surveyed when asked about Muslim people, transgender people, Black people, lesbian and gay people, Hispanic people, women, Jewish people, and Asian people. We can see a large flip at the bottom here when asked about discrimination against Christians and white people. Okay, so let's look at abortion. When it comes to religion, there's a few quotes that I found as examples of some of the language that we hear from those who are pushing abortion restrictions. So in Louisiana, Katrina Jackson said that ending legal abortion will happen through prayer. It'll happen that people come together and really say, this is no longer a party issue, this is a God issue. This is a United States issue, and I believe this is the turning point. Okay, then in Alabama, KIV, after signing the state's abortion ban into law, May 15th, 2019, said this legislation stands as a powerful testament to Alabamians' deeply held belief that every life is precious and that every life is a sacred gift from God. Also in Alabama, Clyde Chambliss said in 2019, I believe that if we terminate the life of an unborn child, we are putting ourselves in God's place. In Missouri, State Rep Holly Rader was explaining her support for Missouri's abortion ban in 2019 and said to stand on this floor and say, how can someone look at a child of rape or incest and care for them? And I say how we can do that. We can do that with the love of God. Okay, recently, Arkansas Governor Asa Hutchinson signed into law one of the country's most restrictive abortion bans, a measure supporters hope will force the U.S. Supreme Court to revisit its 1973 decision sanctioning the procedure. Janet Porter, president of Faith to Action, a Christian group in Ohio, has said what happened in Arkansas will definitely encourage others to take similar action. Okay, so while abortion is technically still legal in all 50 states, there are some states that have adopted a number of other measures affecting abortion, including requiring counseling, requiring a wait period, requiring parental approval if the patient is a minor, restricting public funding, restricting insurance coverage, requiring more than one doctor, requiring it to be performed at a hospital, and allowing doctors to refuse. So this graph is showing the percent of people who oppose allowing hospitals or medical providers to refuse to provide abortion services based on religious objections. So the lower percentage means that they're less opposed to denying services based on religious belief. Higher percentages would mean that they're more opposed to denying services based on religious belief. So we can see the white evangelical Protestant is the lowest percent opposed. Okay, that's 34%. White Catholic, 60%. White mainline Protestant, 61%. Protestant of color, 67%. And religiously unaffiliated, 82%. Okay. So in 2021, here's some of the anti-trans bills that have been introduced. Kentucky Republican Steve Meredith introduced SB 83 on the 7th of January and gives medical care providers that include both doctors and insurance companies the ability to legally refuse trans people health care based on their conscious or religious beliefs. In Alabama, Wes Allen, Chip Brown, Mike Holmes, Arnold Mooney, Philip Pettis are set to introduce HB1 on the 2nd of February, making gender-affirming healthcare for trans youth illegal, and will also force schools to out trans kids to their parents. On the 15th of January, Bruce Borders from the state of Indiana has introduced HB 1456, aiming to make it illegal for trans people to use the bathroom corresponding to their gender. And this graph here is showing the states that have the most restrictive legislations in the red. Okay. This graph is showing the percent of people who said that they oppose allowing each of these following things if doing so violates their religious beliefs. So the gray dot is all Americans, the blue dot is white evangelical Protestant, the green dot is white mainline Protestant, the yellow is Protestant of color, the dark orange is white Catholic, and purple is religiously unaffiliated. So the lower percent is less opposed to allowing So for allowing a small business owner to refuse to provide products or services to gay or lesbian people. allowing hospitals or medical providers in your community to refuse to provide reproductive health services to transgender people, allowing religiously unaffiliated or affiliated agencies that receive taxpayer funding to refuse to accept qualified couples as foster parents if the couples are gay men, religiously affiliated agencies that receive taxpayer funding to refuse to accept qualified couples as foster parents if the couples are lesbian women, religiously affiliated agencies that receive taxpayer funding to refuse to accept qualified couples as adoptive parents if the couples are gay men, religiously affiliated agencies that receive taxpayer funding to refuse to accept qualified couples as adoptive parents if the couples are lesbian women. Okay. And that brings us to discussion time. So what is everyone thinking?